Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
that looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Acts of violence and hate against Jewish people in America have tripled since the October 7th Hamas attack in Israel and the Israeli counterattacks in Gaza. But anti-Semitism is hardly new. It has a history of more than 2,000 years. In this episode of Challenge 2.0, we explore the roots, the fallacies, and the fears that have stoked this ancient and toxic hatred and its costs to all Americans. Well, we're very fortunate to have today as our guest Rabbi Olivier Ben Chaim, and a very familiar face. You've been very gracious in participating in a number of our programs before. Here, not only in terms of your position as Rabbi of Bet Aleph Meditative Synagogue, but I would have to say a scholar on this whole issue of anti-Semitism and related issues with that. So, Olivier, thank you so much for joining us.
It's always my pleasure.
I wish we didn't have to talk about this topic. In your position, both as a spiritual leader of your synagogue, as a family person, you have contacts and you are contacted for, I have to believe, guidance and counsel from many people within your family, friends, community, both within and without the Jewish community. What are they telling you in terms of their experience with anti-Semitism and the increase we've seen over the past months?
Thank you. It's been very difficult. It's been a real challenge. I'm almost constantly invited into conversations. People want to sit down with me, and share what's going on in their life. The last few weeks, I'm holding conversations, group conversations in the community for people to just come and share and be held and be heard, be witnessed by the rest of us. And so we are hearing many different, very difficult stories from people. I have children of college age, and that has been a challenge in itself for my children. There is anxiety for the start of the college year in the fall and what that will look like, especially as we're nearing the elections in November. I think we're concerned that things will just boil up to a dangerous point. But from the members of my community and those who have reached out, I hear really traumatic stories that people are sharing. People losing friends over the last few months, the lack of ability and tolerance amongst our closest friends. It's happening all the time. I mean, close friends, intimate friends, not just your friends on social media. That has been an absolute disaster.
Right.
I'm hearing people who, for years were part like a women's group or a men's group, and suddenly they find themselves excluded. And I'm talking years, people who have had relationships for that many years, and suddenly they are persona non grata. Stories of a person in my community whose doctor fired her from her practice as a patient. I mean, it's really kind of astonishing what we're seeing. A story of one of the members of my community who some 15 years ago had supported a Middle Eastern Muslim person who was coming to the United States to file for asylum, and then supported that person also with a job. That person just in the last few months completely turned on the member of my community, and hateful mails and hateful messages. I mean, we see a lot of hatred that people are receiving from acquaintances and personal relationships. That it's devastating, because we feel ostracized, we feel isolated, we feel excluded, and we feel unsafe. There's a real sense of not feeling safe, not feeling that we can say what we want, who we are. We can speak of our own emotional connection with what's going on. Wherever we fall on the spectrum of our convictions. We're not even asked. And that's been the terrifying experience. And I think, unfortunately, it's going to be getting worse as time goes by. I'm really concerned about it.
Understanding this, and you did a wonderful 13-part lecture series. It's on YouTube, and we're going to put that on the screen for people to be able to access that in greater detail than we can do here. But I think understanding the reach and the foundation of this requires that we take a bit of a deep dive in history. And I think one is that although the founding of the modern state of Israel goes back, to 1948, in fact, the Jewish presence as a culture, as a people in the Middle East extends back not merely centuries, but thousands of years. Can you give us some foundation, some sense of that?
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned earlier that I was a scholar. I'm not a scholar in Jewish history. I'm merely just a rabbi.
Scholarly.
Scholarly, maybe that's a better way. But yes, I studied long and hard because, as you mentioned, I offered this 13-course series for my community. So I immersed myself deeply in the history of anti-Semitism in order to give this course. But in fact, what we can tell for sure historically is based on an artifact that was discovered, an archaeological dig back in Egypt some decades ago. A stela was discovered, and an inscription was on that stela, an inscription that a pharaoh at the time had probably asked one of the scribes to inscribe on the stone. That stela was carbon dated 1200 BCE, and that stela the pharaoh declared and paraphrasing, of course, the fall of Israel in the latest war that had happened, I guess, at the time. And finally, Israel had been destroyed, which is kind of ironic, to have the first archaeological proof of the existence of the nation of Israel, announcing its destruction, looking at that some 3,000 years later. So it's quite ironic. But so we can carbon date at least the existence of Israel as a nation back to that time. I suspect that if there was an Israel at that time, it existed prior to that. But as the Israelite, the Hebrews, eventually the Judeans, under that name, we know ourselves at least to go back 1200 BCE, thanks to that stela. So the word, Judaism itself, it's the Hebrew from Yehudi, right? So Yehudi is what we call, what's in English is Jewish, right? But Yehudi means from the tribe of Judah or from Judea. Either way, it could be from either tribal identity and the tribal and the land entity were the same. So we could be called Jew or we could be called Judean. So in our name is actually our provenance, where we are from. We are Judeans. We're not Jews, we're Judeans. So, we can argue that, obviously, and I do, that we are the indigenous people of that land, going back thousands of years, for sure.
Another fall involved that when the Romans invaded Israel.
Yes.
And it seems like a lot of our discussion might begin with that element. Can you tell me a little bit about the Jewish experience of Roman rule once they took over Judea?
Yes, it's always confounding to me that every time I watch documentaries or I hear people here in America talking about Rome, it's like this amazing civilization that seemingly couldn't do no wrong, and we should all aspire to be like the Romans, and and be mindful of talking about the Roman collapse, and be mindful of that because we so identify with that. For the Jewish people, that is not the history of Rome that we remember or that we experienced at all. Rome was a very violent empire, as most empires have been. The Roman emperors were no pro-democratic peacemakers. They were butchers. They were dictators. They were awful people who spread bloodshed and disaster wherever they conquered.
Mm-hmm.
And Judea was no different. Rome was a very brutal rule over Judea. The Roman Empire engaged in what's known as the war against the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
In the hundreds of years that they found themselves there. And that really was an absolute multi-generational bloodshed. We estimate that 2/3 of our people perished or was enslaved during that time. We think of Rome, we think in the context of Christianity, of crucifixion, right? Mm-hmm. The crucifixion of Jesus. But crucifixions happened dozens of times every day during the Roman rule. Mm-hmm. Those were modalities of punishment that were so common that mm-hmm. It barely caused people to turn their head, and it was an incredible and with that Jews revolted many times, time and times again. There was just a publication actually yesterday that found that there was a little known revolt that happened all the way to 350 CE of the Common Era. It's probably the last known revolt at this point. So Jews continued to revolt against the regime even in the beginning of the Byzantine Empire, in the Byzantine era. So for the longest time, we fought against the empire and paid dearly with our lives. Mm-hmm.
2/3, as you said.
2/3.
As you started to introduce, when we brought Jesus into the picture and the emergence of first what was called the Way and later Christianity, as we look at the Gospels, the Gospel of John in particular, we think of the attribution of what happened to Jesus and his followers as sort of a collective blame placed on all people. A lot of scholars within the Christian faith are calling that into question. Could you give us your sense of that?
Sure. So my sense is really based on historical report is mostly that, so Passover was one of the three major pilgrimage holidays, which meant that every time ahead of Passover, throngs of Jews would come from all over the Middle East, Egypt, Iraq, wherever Jews were, to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So it was always a really fraught time for the Roman forces, because they always feared that with so many Jews coming in, there could be real potential for a revolt. And so they were always on heightened, there was heightened security, if you want. And at the time, because of the violence and because of so much mass murder was happening, there really was a sense from the Jewish population, from the Judean population, that these were the end of time. I mean, religiously, people really felt with so much death, so much bloodshed, that we were nearing the end of time, as predicted in our sacred books. So you would see actually messiahs popping up everywhere, calling people to repent, to mend their ways, because it seemed that this was the end of time. So the story of Jesus, I think, obviously from the Christian perspective, is unique and but from the Jewish perspective, Jesus was just another one of them, just another one of those Jews who came and preached, change your ways, do it differently, who came to the temple maybe and stood on that soapbox and hearing the masses. And so the Jews would not have really at the time been paying too much attention to that. They came for their Passover. They came to do their sacrifices at the Temple Mount. And if there were crucifixions, if the story of Jesus unfolded the way we know it unfolded, the people at the time would not have been worried about that. It was not their main concern, specifically that Holy Week, to worry about yet another Jew, another Judean, one of theirs. I mean, in my book, they would have been even more devastated. They would never have encouraged it. They would never have sided against anyone.
Well, that brings up a question, and that is the stories of mass turnout for accusations by masses of Jewish people arguing against Jesus and for conviction, and then lining the route to where he was crucified. Does that make sense, falling within Passover week, that you'd have people setting aside their holiday plans and holy day plans and turning out for something of that sort?
Absolutely not. I can't imagine that being the case. But I understand from the Christian perspective. I mean, you want to put Jesus at the center of a story, and so you want to surround the story with everybody was concerned about him. And what I'm trying to say is that is historically probably was not the case. So it springs to me from two things. One is, by the time the Gospels are written, there's a real yearning for the writers of the Gospels to get on the good side of Rome, right? To really, get Rome to support their cause, to embrace their cause. And so you can't write a story that accuses the Romans of killing your Messiah if you want the Roman authorities to support your movement. So I think there is some political concerns in the writing of the story as one thing. The other thing is that you're writing a story to try to differentiate yourself from your sibling. Right? There is a little bit of a sibling rivalry here between the birth of Christianity and the birth of rabbinic Judaism that carries from the destruction of the temple eventually. So you have two currents in Judaism at that time that are competing with each other. It's called sibling rivalry. And oftentimes in sibling rivalry, if you have known that, and
many of our viewers are going to be familiar with that.
So in order to, if you have a brother and you want to put yourself forward, you're going to accuse your brother of all the evils that are going on in the house. That's part of the sibling rivalry, so that the parents will side with you. And I think there's a lot of that going on here. In all the anti-Jewish accusations in the gospel is also a way to differentiate yourself and to tell your followers, don't go with these guys. Look how evil they are. Follow our path. So I think both of those are at play.
How likely was it that Jewish leaders would have been able to demand the death penalty for Jesus? Sure. And also, was it reality that there was a popular release of one prisoner as opposed to another at that time by Roman governors such as Pontius Pilate?
Yeah, I think it's quite unrealistic. I can't imagine Pontius Pilate to have engaged in any kind of negotiation or let himself be influenced by any kind of Jewish leadership. And if there was any kind of Jewish leadership at the time, they were probably very concerned and busy with what's going on in the Temple Mount because it was Passover. Probably not being able to pull away from, hundreds of thousands of people wanting their and needing their presence there. But knowing Pontius Pilate, I can't imagine him ever caring for what the Jews thought. I mean, this is a governor who just massacred the Samaritans up north in the land of Israel.
He was recalled because of the level of his brutality by Rome.
Yes, so I can't. This is not the kind of person you want to imagine as a negotiator.
As we see with the fall of Rome, any period of rapid change and destabilization as occurred then, and to a certain extent I think we see that today with a rapid change, leads to just an explosion of conspiracy theories and fear. And I believe we saw that as we led out of the Roman period and into the establishment of all these little fiefdoms and kingdoms. And didn't that happen? And what were some examples of the cost of that to Jewish people, the sort of conspiracy theories that suddenly started popping up around them, were focused on them?
So there are many of those conspiracy theories, and I think they stem from the Gospels, and they continue to be amplified over the centuries by the church again, in order to differentiate itself from Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Briefly, those two that I want to mention. The first one is related to what happened on the Temple Mount during the Passover and Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers. That leads to the anti-Semitic tropes of Jews are greedy, miserly, hoarding, whatever the consequences of that. We still hear about, the conspiracy theories about the Jews control the banks, the Jews control the financial systems, the Jews control Wall Street. That actually, paradoxically, is just a through line from the story of the money changers on the temple. So the story of the money changer is fascinating because why were there money changers on the Temple Mount? Like I said, Jews came as a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover, and they came from everywhere. And so they all came with the currency that existed in the country where they lived. And in order to participate in the Passover ritual, which was still at the time based on animal sacrifices, not only did they needed to come, and they didn't bring their own animals from Egypt or from Iraq. They bought them right there and then. But they couldn't buy them unless they had the currency that was available or necessary at the time in Jerusalem. So they brought their coins and they exchanged their coins with the local coins so that they could go and purchase the doves, the whatever they needed to. The doves were the cheapest, and I think it's mentioned in the gospel. And so they could participate in Passover. The money changers were actually highly regulated. You had to be very kosher. You had to be really following the rules of the temple. There were no banks in the streets of Jerusalem at the time. So it's not like, these money changers belonged to the infrastructure of the temple. And the funds, the coins, the coins to exchange were also held inside of the temple. So there were no separation of capitalism and religion at the time. There was no capitalism. So there was really a service that the temple offered to the pilgrims, right? And it all was, clear and clean. There was nobody there was there to make a profit. It was to facilitate worship. That's what it was there for. The story is explained differently by the church. When my sense is, and some scholars would agree, and there's probably more interpretations of the story as all biblical stories, is that Jesus didn't overturn violently the table, violence is very uncharacteristic of his personality. So there's something also to look at here in the way the story is told. But the sense that some scholars, biblical scholars, are taking from this, that he was actually not fighting the greed and the avarice of the money changers, right? But he was taking a stand because he felt that the system didn't allow the poorest among his people, among the Jews, among the Judeans, to participate in the ritual. The poorest were excluded because of the need to buy. Even so, the story of the dove, because it's the cheapest, is most important here, because it says they couldn't even get the dove, right? It's a social activist, not an accusation of greed on the part of the Jews. Jesus was a Jew, so he wouldn't do that. The second story really is what we talked about, is the Jews killed Jesus, right? So those two stories are a through line through antiquity and through the Middle Ages. The Jews killed Jesus. The Jews are therefore...
As a collective group,
not just... Of course, as a collective. The Jews are therefore the evilest people that it could ever exist, right? They are by definition, as the killer of Christ, the Antichrist, right? So if you're the Antichrist, then all the evils of society can be ascribed to you. And when you live through the Middle Ages, which were very challenging, very difficult times, where infant mortality was through the roof, the plague, famines, all of that, you needed a scapegoat as the ruler, as the church, to not be blamed for all of this. And so, you told those stories against the Jews every Sunday morning at church, those stories infused people's consciousness. People were not literate. It's not like people had access to other books. They came to church. That was all they understood from reality. That was the reality of the world they were given for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and generations. And so it's not far-fetched to then say, well, the Jews are poisoning the wells, which is why we have the plague. It's the Jews who are doing it. Children would venture out of a village in the woods to play, as children have not been known to do for hundreds and hundreds of years. One gets hurt, one disappears. There is a lot of kidnapping happening at the time. A child disappears. Well, it's the nearby Jews who kidnapped the kid, killed the kid, because they used their blood on Passover to make matzah. That's the blood libel.
That was the story that was passed at that time.
Yes, absolutely. We see it as far north as England.
It's obvious that we are just part of the way through the story and what we'd like to talk about. So we're going to advance to the current era and what we're seeing and where people can maybe go. You've been very agreeable to extending this conversation.
Absolutely.
So although we're going to say that's all we can cover this week, we hope that you'll tune in again with us next week as we continue this conversation. So Olivier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And please do tune in again next week on the next edition and the remainder of our conversation with Rabbi Olivier here on Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much.